Norman, what is your take about, let me go back to the original question, the true face of the Israeli electorate. Why did they vote for Benjamin Netanyahu when polls days before had him down?
Well, all the analysis show that in the last few days, Benjamin Netanyahu ran on two particular points. Number one, no to a Palestinian state. And number two, he was engaged in racist fear-mongering, telling the Israeli Jewish electorate that the Arabs were voting in droves and that you have to go out to stop this Arab piling up at the polls. And that's what swung the last about 4 or 5 percentage points in Netanyahu's favor. Now, I agree with Mr. Hoffman that crazy things are happening in the region, that's for sure. You have the crazy ISIS in Syria and elsewhere. You have the crazy Saudis, and you also have, of course, the crazy Israelis. I'm not going to sing patriotic songs to the United States. We have our racial problems for sure. We have racist police. We have a racist judicial system. But the fact of the matter is, in the last 2 elections, the American people twice elected a black person to office, an African American. In the case of Israel, they've just elected the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan into office. There's a lot of lunacy going on in Israel, and the election showed.
Excuse me, in this election,
or the true face of the Israeli electorate.
Okay, I mean, again,
go out and try to beat Netanyahu.
So they did come out in droves, but I mean, influences. I mean, what was Netanyahu doing in Washington, D.C.? I mean, well, that's an interesting external influence in American politics. Go right ahead.
Well, Gil gives a good insight into the nature of the Israeli mentality. He's telling us that the entire world, every single world leader who said that Netanyahu came out against the Palestinian state, everybody is wrong. Everybody's suffering from an illusion. Everybody's suffering from a delusion. The New York Times is wrong. All the world leaders are wrong. But actually, Benjamin Netanyahu came out in favor of 2 states. That's the Israeli mentality. It has nothing to do with the real world. It's clear Benjamin Netanyahu never supported 2 states. And now he came out openly against it. And the Israeli electorate, because it's not just Mr. Netanyahu, but it's all the parties to the right of Netanyahu who oppose 2 states, they form a majority of Israel. We've been told for years and years that the Israeli people, they actually support 2 states. But if you look at the opinion polls, 75% of Israelis support annexation of the major settlement blocks. 75% of Israelis support Israel's retention of the Jordan Valley. 75% of Israelis support keeping all of Jerusalem for Israel. That's not 2 states. That's 1 state plus for Israel and a garbage dump for the Palestinians. That's the Israeli electorate. That's the reality. If you want to understand Israel as an American, all you have to do is look at the American South before the Civil Rights era. The same meanness, the same vicious racism, the same sense of superiority. But in the case of Israelis, it's not just superiority when it comes to Arabs. There's this kind of Jewish supremacy, Jewish superiority when it comes to everyone. That's why when Mr. Netanyahu came to Congress, the first people to back out, the first Congress people to back out, were the Congressional Black Caucus, because they immediately sensed that this is not just a Jewish supremacist. This is a vicious, filthy racist who was slighting the President of the United States because he was African American. Everybody knows if George Bush had been in power, and if George Bush had been in power and not Barack Obama, Mr. Netanyahu would never dare carry out that stunt.
Okay, Norman, let's...
He did it
no filibustering, no filibustering. I want to go back to... I want fair time. Let's go to Gil. You want to react there, Gil? Jump in. That's the point of the program. Gil,
it's important to understand.
Let's clarify, though. Okay, let's be honest. Let's stay with the facts. Okay, Norman, you want to react real quickly before we go to the break?
But here we have another example of the Israeli connection with reality, or how tenuous it is. He's now telling us, after Mr. Netanyahu ran on a platform which explicitly said no to a Palestinian state and won what's been called now an overwhelming victory in Israel, we now have Mr. Gil Hoffman come on your program and tell us that the support for the opposition to a Palestinian state is zero in Israel. That's what he's telling you. Opposition to a Palestinian state.
Go ahead, Norman.
Gil, you're really embarrassing yourself. This is not Israel. You're on a program which is broadcast to the entire world. How can you be saying the things you're now uttering on this program? The Palestinians don't want to negotiate. It's the Palestinians that are the obstacle. You know full well that your prime minister said no to a Palestinian state. You know full well that the Israeli electorate, using the language of Israel now, overwhelmingly voted for that prime minister. You know full well that the Palestinian Authority has been trying desperately to find a two-state settlement of the conflict now for about 30 or 40 years, well, before the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, already as far back as 1976, 1978, the Palestinians were trying to negotiate that settlement. You know full well that Israel's the obstacle, not because Israel is evil. It's a very simple fact. Israel has a cost-free occupation. The Europeans pay the bills in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority does the dirty work. It imprisons Palestinians. It tortures the Palestinians. That's called security cooperation. And the United States protects Israel diplomatically at the UN and other international forums. And so why should the Israelis withdraw? They get to have their cake. They build these luxurious communities in the occupied Palestinian territories, stealing the water resources, stealing a lot of the most arable Palestinian land. They get to relocate with government subsidies in the occupied Palestinian territories, and they get nothing and they lose nothing. It's a cost-free occupation. It's probably the first cost-free occupation in the history of humanity. And so why should the Israelis withdraw? There's only one way to bring about a two-state settlement, and that's to make Israel pay the price for its illegal, immoral, and inhuman occupation of Palestinian territory that now has gone on for nearly a half-century. The problem, Mr. Hoffman, is he counts on the ignorance of your viewers. But I'm sorry to report to you, Mr. Hoffman, I'm fully cognizant of the record, and now I'm going to go through it. Number one, he did not offer 100% of the West Bank. He wanted to keep what's now called 8.7% of the West Bank, or what's effectively the major settlement blocks would go to Israel. About 8.7% of the West Bank, including the major settlement blocks, which would include the critical water resources, would go to Israel. Some of the most arable
There's already an agreement on water that was worked out.
Israel would be the Palestinian state would be bisected in the north. It would also be bisected at its waist with a settlement, Ma'ale Adumim, stretching from Jerusalem to Jericho. You say he offered to take back thousands of refugees. Let's see exactly what he offered. He offered to take back 5,000 refugees. Now, there are about 5 to 6 million Palestinian refugees. He offered to take back 5,000 refugees, 1,000 refugees each year over a 5-year period, under what's called family reunification. And in fact, that offer was made informally, and Omar was already going out of office because of corruption scandals. So there was no possibility that that offer, totally unsatisfactory, totally unacceptable, but even that
You won't be satisfied until there's no Jewish state at all. I know you. I know your history.
Mr. Hoffman, if you know me as you claim to know me, you'll know I'm very conservative on this question. I support international law, 2 states on the June 67 border with a just solution of the refugee question. That's what the United Nations General Assembly, about 165 members, say each year. That's what the International Court of Justice says.
If you have millions of refugees coming from all over the world, there's no Jewish state.
All right, gentlemen, let's move forward here.
But as soon as Obama's gone, things are going to be better.
Norman, what do you say to that? Because does it really matter to the Palestinians what relationship there is?
There's another example of the Israeli mindset. Mr. Obama is trying to put pressure on Netanyahu. Mr. Obama, along with the 4 other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council and Germany, have been trying to negotiate a diplomatic settlement with Iran. There are 2 countries in the world which oppose that diplomatic settlement. 2 lunatic countries which oppose diplomacy
Canada
and want
Australia?
to go to war. They are the Wahhabi jihadis in Saudi Arabia and the Jewish jihadis in Israel. Those are the bookends. Saudi Arabia and Israel want to go to war. The rest of the world wants a diplomatic settlement. And then Mr. Netanyahu barges in on the U.S. Congress in order to humiliate Mr. Obama. Mr. Hoffman, again, I'm not a flag waver, but do you really think the American people need Mr. Netanyahu to hold up his Looney Tune Daffy Duck cartoons to explain to us diplomacy with Iran? Excuse me, but we're smart enough
I have the polls
to
about
figure
America.
these things out.
70% support Netanyahu's position, not Obama's on Iran.
Without Mr. Netanyahu's Looney Tune
All right, gentlemen,
cartoons.
we've run out of time. Most Americans do support a 2-state solution. Many thanks to my guests in New York and in Jerusalem.